Hello and welcome to part 4 of this tutorial in which we'll take an in-depth look at 2 advanced features for grading in the Google Classroom Learning Management System. We'll be looking at Google Forms, and then I'll explore how we can set up quizzes and quiz assignments with forms, and then we'll look at Google Classroom's Rubrics feature. These are really powerful features for speeding up and facilitating your grading workflow. The timestamps for each of those sections is on your screen now, so you can skip ahead if you're interested in one section in particular. I'm going to start out with a basic overview of Google Forms, so if you're already familiar with Google Forms, you can skip ahead to the timestamp on your screen where I begin to cover using forms as quizzes. Google Forms are surveys that you can create, and when someone fills it out, you can see their responses, analyze them as data, and even save them on a Google Sheet for reference. They're really quite useful, even outside of a classroom setting. My school uses them for everything from getting teacher feedback on school initiatives to inputting narrative comments for report cards, or even just voting on what food to order for a team lunch. So here's the Google Form editor, showing what it looks like when we create a new form from scratch. Here at the top, you can give the form a name and a description, and here in the center, we'll be adding our questions. And you can see that Forms has already created an untitled question by default. Here, you would write the question itself, and because this question is multiple choice, you also need to add an answer option, and you can add more options as well, or you can add an other field that lets respondents write in their own answer. You can also use images as the options or even as the question. There are a few other options here at the bottom. This one lets you duplicate the question, and this one deletes it. Here, you can toggle whether you want the question to be required or not. If it is required, respondents can't submit the form until they've answered it. Otherwise, they can skip it. Finally, we have a few more options hidden in this menu here. Show description lets us add a subheader with a description under the question. Go to section based on answer will let you set certain answers to send respondents to different parts of the form if you've set up sections. And shuffle option order causes the options of this multiple choice question to be presented in a random order every time someone fills out the form. Here, we can change the type of question we're asking. There are lots of different types of questions, but my most frequently used types are multiple choice and short answer. Unsurprisingly, short answer just lets the respondent write in their answer instead of choosing from options. I encourage you to experiment with the other types, but this tutorial will only focus on those two, and they're plenty powerful on their own. Here on the right, we have a toolbar where we can add a new question, or I can import questions from forms I've made previously, and I can add titles, images, videos, or subsections to my form. Images and videos aren't just for decoration, by the way. In my music class, I've used videos to embed songs for listening analyses, and I know of art teachers who put in like an image of a painting or drawing and ask questions about it. Up here at the top, the palette lets us customize the color and theme of our form, and the eye lets us preview how it will look for respondents. The gear lets us customize the settings, and we'll be looking at that shortly. The send button gives us lots of options for distributing the form, like a link we can share or embed, and we can also send out the form directly by email. So let's go to the eye and preview our form. This is how it will look to our respondents. All they can really do is fill it out, which I'll go ahead and do now. So when we go back to the editing page, we can see that a response was registered here. On the responses page, you can see there are lots of options for analyzing and visualizing the data, and we can even click here to export the responses to a Google Sheet that becomes associated with this form. And this is really cool because each new response will append a new line to the sheet with the answers that were given every time the form is filled out. This is really useful for keeping track of responses. Before moving on, let's take a look at the settings. General settings relate to how our form works. Presentation settings relate to how it looks and how the questions are arranged for the respondents. And quizzes settings relate to how our form behaves for our students as a quiz. I want to focus specifically on 2 important settings. First, on the general page, you'll see this option to collect email addresses. Now, by checking it, the form will automatically collect the respondent's email address and associate it with their responses. You'll want to be conscious of whether you want your respondents to remain anonymous and use this option accordingly. But when we use Google Classroom to create quizzes, this actually will be on by default because, of course, we want to know which student gave which response. Next, let's look at the quizzes section of the settings menu. In order to create self-grading quizzes for our students, we need to toggle the Make This a Quiz button on. Quiz mode is where the magic happens here because it allows us to create answers to our form questions and set them to be correct or incorrect, which is what will allow the form to grade itself automatically when it's filled out by comparing the respondents' answers to the ones that we set. We don't even need to see their responses when we do this, although we can. Again, when we use Google Classroom to create these quizzes, the toggle for this will be on by default. There are lots more settings to explore, but they're beyond the scope of this tutorial. With these, we're ready to set up our first quiz assignment. So now that we understand the basics of Google Forms, let's head back to Google Classroom and create a quiz assignment. You'll see that when I create the assignment, Google Classroom creates a blank quiz automatically. As I mentioned, the defaults here are set the way we need them, so you don't need to customize the settings unless you have something specific you want to tweak. You can also attach a quiz if you've made one previously, but you would have to make sure that it was set up in quiz mode. Once a quiz is attached, we'll see this toggle to enable grade importing appear, and you'll definitely want to toggle this one on. I'll be showing you what that does shortly. As you normally would, set a due date, topic, and point value. The point value can be overwritten by the total points of the quiz, so this could change, although you do need to set a point value in order for this to work. Clicking into our newly made quiz, we can see mostly the same options as before, but now there's this answer key option here. I'll create my question and then click that answer key button. Here, we can tell the form the correct answers, and note that we can also select multiple answers to be correct. We can also give this question a point value. Each new question to which I assign a point value updates the total point value of the quiz here, and that final value is what will appear on my grades page in Google Classroom when I'm finished, and what will overwrite the grade total that I set for the assignment, if it's different. Here, we can type in feedback that will be shown automatically to the student after they've completed the quiz. I'll go ahead and make another question, this time a short answer question. Now, in order to be marked correct, the student's response to a short answer question has to match the answer key exactly as I typed it, even the capitalization of the letters. Now, you could add multiple correct answers, with each one trying to catch right answers that are typed slightly differently, but unless you want to spend your time typing in every possible edge case for how a response might be written, my recommendation is to use short answer questions when you're actually testing on spelling, punctuation, capitalization, or other aspects of how the words are actually typed. So these are good for things like vocab or spelling quizzes, or maybe writing chemical or mathematical formulas exactly how they're supposed to be typed. You will be able to see the students' responses, and you can override the automatic grading if you think a correct answer was counted wrong, but the convenience of these quizzes is really that you don't have to look at every response. So if you want to avoid this problem altogether, use multiple choice questions, and if you do plan to look at every response, my recommendation would be just to create a regular assignment instead of a quiz and use the grading tool to review student responses individually. Okay, my quiz is finished and assigned, and here we're watching my two students taking it. You'll see that when they both submit the quiz, their grades will be available to them immediately, which is an optional setting that I like to enable. The students appreciate it, but you can withhold the grade and release it later if you want, after you've reviewed it. Now that they've finished, they can see the feedback that I built into each question. I'll head back to the teacher's account now, and since we have grade importing enabled, I have this button here that says import grades. When I click it, you'll see that Michaela's and Gabe's grades appear as drafts here. Now take a moment to appreciate just how incredible this is. You know, with just 2 students, it may feel a bit excessive to do all this work and set this up instead of just reviewing their answers, but I teach 180 students, and multiple choice quizzes that grade themselves literally save me hours of grading, and they only take a few minutes to set up. I do grade written work individually, and I don't really even use short answer questions very much because anything they write I want to read myself. But for short formatives or checks for understanding, things like that, these multiple choice quizzes are just fantastic. If I want to, I can also click into my Google Form editing page and I can see their individual responses as well as visualizations of the data on how my class did and answer breakdowns by question. I can also release the grades from here if I withheld them. So this is a pretty fantastic tool that I recommend getting familiar with. Let's move on and take a look at the Rubrics feature of Google Classroom. Now, quizzes are great when we don't need to look at our students' individual responses, but I don't think we should approach all of our assessment that way. Personal and individualized feedback is really important for our students. It's important for learning and for relationship building. And we don't want our students to forget that they have a teacher, right? I also want to preface this by mentioning that rubrics are very popular and they're a well-documented tool for assessment well beyond Google Classroom, just in general. And there's no shortage of resources with best practices for writing and deploying them. In my experience, the most important thing with rubrics is to be specific and detailed in your level descriptors, so students know what they have to do to achieve a given score. If your wording is vague or subjective, your students will argue with you about their grades, and rightfully so if they think that the grade is based on your opinion. In this tutorial, I'm focusing specifically on how Google Classroom lets us build and use the rubrics, and I just threw these together to demonstrate the tools. But if you do make use of this tool and you haven't used rubrics before, I strongly encourage you to look into writing quality rubrics. The quality of your descriptors supersedes any convenience that Google Classroom's grading tool gives us. That being said, let's get started building one and see just how powerful this feature is. I'll start by creating a regular assignment the way I normally would, and I'll attach a worksheet I already created in Google Docs. I'll set up my assignment with points, a due date, a topic like I normally would, and then I'll find this option to add a rubric underneath those settings. When I click it, I have three options: create rubric, reuse rubric, and import from sheets. We'll start by creating one, and I'll touch briefly on the other two options later on. This is the rubric builder. You'll note that the rubric's name is the assignment's name, and I can't change that. This rubric is associated with the assignment. For now, our rubric has one criterion, which we can give a name and a description. A criterion is basically a subscale of the total point value for a specific part of the assignment we're going to assess. Within the criterion, we can add new levels above or below this one, which are point values. In each level, we can add the point value, level title, and a description of that level. Now, these are our level descriptors for the rubric that tell students what they have to do on the assignment to get this score in this criterion. So the title and description are optional, as in Google lets you build and save this rubric without them. But in terms of practice, you really should fill them in, as this will not only facilitate your own grading workflow, but students can also see these levels and descriptors, and by reading them, they'll know what you're looking for. Be specific. That's good practice on a rubric. On this assignment, we'll be evaluating both the accuracy of the answers mathematically, as well as the spelling of the answers. Now, I don't know how many math teachers out there are quizzing students on how to spell, but hey, bear with me, I'm a music teacher. Our first criterion is accuracy, or getting the right answers, so I'll name it and I'll add a description. Then, because there are 5 questions, I'll create 5 levels. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 points each, based on how many questions the student got right. As I add levels, you'll notice the point value of the rubric increasing accordingly. Next, I'll click here to add my second criterion, which is spelling. Again, there are 5 levels for the 5 questions, and again, the point value of the rubric increases as I add levels. I'll add titles and descriptions to finish up, and now I have a 10-point rubric, with 5 points each for accuracy and spelling, or 2 points per question, and I'll save the rubric, and the rubric is now attached to the assignment. Taking a look from my students' perspectives, you'll notice that they can also review the rubric. Let's have them complete the assignments and submit them. I'll head back to the teacher account and take a look at their work. So here in the gradebook, I can see that both students have turned their work in, and I'll open up the grading tool to look at it. Here on the right, in addition to the features we saw in part 2 of the basics tutorial, you can see that our rubric is also included on the sidebar. These disclosure triangles let us read the titles and descriptors we wrote for each level, and all I need to do is click a level to apply that grade to that criterion. Now look what happened to the student's grade when I clicked that. Even though my rubric is on a 10-point scale, the assignment is graded out of 100, which I set when I made the assignment. But the grade is actually calculated out of that total, which is really convenient, especially when you reuse rubrics. Now, as I work through my student submissions, I can grade them quickly and easily by just selecting levels on the rubric rather than coming up with a grade myself. Even if you had an external rubric on hand that you were referencing, I think the ability to embed the levels right here next to the work and click them is really convenient, and it eases my mental burden when I'm grading. I've put all my rubrics into Google Classroom and I don't envision going back. Okay, I'm going to return these and we'll head over to the students' accounts where they can see that I've graded them. In addition to seeing their grade as a number, they can also see the rubric right on the assignment page, and they can see the levels I selected in the grading tool. So for instance, rather than just seeing a 60% or a 60 out of 100, Gabe knows that he did really well on accuracy, but he needs to work on his spelling, while Michaela did pretty well on spelling, but needs to work on her accuracy. Both got the same grade, but by breaking up the rubric into criteria, the feedback becomes more individual and detailed for each student. And this is a feature of all good rubrics, but I particularly like the way that Google Classroom's rubrics work in practice and the way they're presented to the students here visually. Before finishing up, let me just quickly show you how you can reuse rubrics and save them as Google Sheets. If we make a new assignment and click on the Add Rubric button, I can reuse rubrics I've created before. The use case for this would be that I want to apply the same criteria, levels, and descriptors from one assignment to a different assignment. And because the rubric grade is recalculated into the total points we've set for this assignment, I don't have to update anything. I can just use the rubric as is. I can also edit it if I want. Finally, there's the option to import from Sheets. Now to see how that works, let's first go back to the rubric we made previously for the math assignment, and under the main rubric menu here, I have the option to export to Sheets, which I'll click. What this does is to generate a Google Sheets document that contains our rubric formatted in a very specific way, with the title of the rubric as the title of the sheet and our criteria, levels, and descriptions here in the table. Google is being pretty clear with this admonition to not edit rubrics in a spreadsheet format, and actually the primary use cases I have for these are not for editing, but rather for sharing my rubrics with other teachers who aren't in my Google Classroom so they can't reuse them, and for personal backup and future-proofing. So I might use the rubric again next year, but I won't be able to reuse it from this Google Classroom because I will have archived it. In any case, once that's done, we can go back to our new assignment and import the rubric from Sheets. When we choose the rubric we want from Sheets, Classroom will actually import the data into the rubric builder, so we can make changes or add and remove things like levels or criteria before we save it. And from here, the process is the same as before. We can save it and get to grading. Pretty cool, huh?